To Brooklyn with Love, from the book Warrior for Peace, read here by the author, Steve Mason.
The seventh man I knew I ever killed caught me with a mouthful of tuna. At the time, I didn't see any reason not to finish the sandwich, but I've never forgiven myself for not having the decency to spit that bite out. I thought of him on May 7th, 1985, the day of the New York City parade to welcome home America. Thought of him like a slap to the face when I stepped from the subway car onto the elevated platform above New Utrecht Avenue, Brooklyn. I was born in Brooklyn in the beginning of the war in Europe. I was born again sometime later in the middle of another war in Asia. First time I was born was as an American. The last time was as a human being. Either way, this special day, I was coming home. To my country, to the old neighborhood, and to the house where I was born. It was a gray, sometimes rainy day, the kind when buildings and sky and the faces of people blend with time itself into a kind of oneness, some kind of haunting, shapeless thing without color, like a child's lump of clay waiting in the attic to be discovered. I stood at the end of the platform, a foot on the railing, and leaned out and into it, this thing within myself that waited for me out there. The small windows of Brooklyn apartments were inset against the telephone lines, like black notes on sheet music. One upon the other, my eye fell on them, like the armature of a music box. And I watched the classic melody of the borough of Brooklyn play behind my mind, like Debussy's Clair de Lune, just like my father played it, one stop closer to Coney Island, a lifetime before mine, when the century was new, and he was just another Italian kid growing up in the new world, a stealer of apples, a player of punchball, of stoop ball, and of the violin. The proof of those times was not on the streets nor in the houses. It was, and is, in my blood. A liquid menagerie of pulsing moments, shared by parents when I was young, and more violently by the steel-hard traumas of their lives, injected into my grooved veins like congenital pinballs, bruising straight from my brain, lit for replay with the pounding ding-ding-ding of synchronicity. Today, this time, this place, would light my inside-outside world with the bumper bonus of 3 generations on both sides of the family, Brooklynites all. I left the platform and found the street level, absently like a suicide hits the laws of gravity, hard. Like the coming to all facts is hard. Truth comes more slowly to our lives. I stood there flat-footed on the naked, wet fact that I was standing on a Brooklyn street in the spring of 1985, emotionally dissolving in and of myself, and that when I hit the street level, I had come to stand squarely in my past. I shuffled toward home, a reluctant negotiation, feet caught in an undertow of 4 decades pulling at the reality of my calendar. Memory argued with reason. Storefronts and curbs wavered between then and now. Flat memories surfaced at the street like dead flounder, and I began to remember. The war with Germany was coming to a close about the time I hit the streets as a boy. Those were the Lash LaRue penny candy days of singing lariats, cast-iron cap guns, and all-day matinees. I don't know who it was who designed the silver handles on the Good Humor truck, but the guy who came up with the Saturday matinee was a genius. Movies, serials, cartoons, all in a theater so dark, so fun, so delicious, we'd emerge hours later, blinking, disoriented, giggling psychotics who shielded our eyes from the reality of Brooklyn like we were mole men up from a deep hole for a quick look-see. You remember those bag lunches? Mashed egg sandwiches made with love, hard-boiled eggs wrapped in cut-right wax paper, a whack of salami, some carrot sticks, enough Yankee Doodle cupcakes to withstand a biblical famine, and then the candy counter. Jeez. How come? How come we got so much food? How come most of us from the old neighborhood to this day spell love F-O-O-D? Because in those days food was scarce. and sacrificing for kids was a way of life, a philosophy. But mostly because the mothers and grandmothers who prepared those huge sacks for us little kids were refugee European women born with a siege mentality and a sense that each time they said goodbye it might be the last. Memories of the Four Horsemen rode through the blood of those nurturing women like a vaccination at birth. With each rhythmic movement of their short, full bodies was the economy of appreciation, a grace which said, "This day, a gift from God, we will not take for granted." A laugh, a good joke, a mischief without pain. The joys of life were not wasted on these wise women. For them there was much victory each day in the evil which did not befall their families. For them, nothing new from a son-in-law meant there would be food again tomorrow for a daughter, that their grandchildren were today still all alive, and that no one had been stolen from his bed last night to be punished for a crime he had not committed. We children were not secure in the stability of our world. We were secure only in the love of the women who mothered us. Sitting in those long-gone theaters, munching goodies in the dark, left none of us in doubt just how much we were loved, or how much of the family dream was riding on us. We were gilted with the responsibility to be the most we were capable of being, not just for ourselves, but for all the family, on both sides of the ocean, on both sides of life. When a kid pressed his nose like a hungry porpoise up to the ticket window in those days and said his much rehearsed speech, "One small, please," what he got for his 10 cents was a small green ticket to a fun afternoon and a whole lot of love for a lifetime. Those were good times for America. Not in America, but for it. For a country that denied equal rights to half its population and dissuaded an entire portion of its minorities from voting, America was the world champion of the oppressed. We were defeating the worst enemies of the free world, and although in fact we were not the home of the free, we were certainly the home of the brave. And what is more, we were winners. In Brooklyn, we had it all. We were free and brave. It could be seen in our neighborhood. In those times, on those streets, big took care of little. It was the credo of the block. Oh, what a block! At the end of World War II, Manhattan was being squeezed into the juice of Europe, a kind of Niedix blend of the world. Not so in Brooklyn. Brooklyn was a traditional fruit cocktail, a Del Monte of the world. We kept our integrity, yet we encouraged our commonality. We were the world floating in a bowl the size of one perfect neighborhood. Yes, the country was at war, but our neighborhood lived in peace. This was America. The Pilgrims stepped onto Plymouth Rock and just took off, but many of our folks stepped ashore on Ellis Island, walked over to Brooklyn to be near a relative, and never left. Some never moved to another block. Everything a person needed was right there inside 2-3 blocks. Everything. A good place to live. My world back then was bordered by the movies on one side and the public school on the other. In the middle was the ball field, one magic step off the curb. On this day, I stopped my reverie to stand before my old school, PS 103. Hands deep in my raincoat pockets, I stood on that corner, pencil straight like I did on those long-ago autumn days when the wind turned crisp and the school rose slow into the morning like a castle from the moors, stiff and formal, a fortress of emerging civilization in the middle of our common world and separate traditions. Into this institution, little children, who were the final dreams of a lifelong family commitment, entered either the boys' side or the girls' side, as Italians or Jews, Irish, and who knew what, and who cared, all aged 6. They exited 6 years later, through the front doors, Americans. But we didn't know about that. That was for parents. We had work to do. In Brooklyn, a kid's work was play, and it was serious. We did it better in Brooklyn than anywhere else in the world. If it was true that the air war in Europe was won on the playing fields of Eton, then surely in Brooklyn was the developing humanity which would one day win a lasting peace in our world. What a bunch of kids we was. We was the best. Bet you, chump, anything you got to lose. We was the best ever. World class, sure. The truth was that the kids on the streets of Brooklyn were the most diligent scholars in the world. They applied everything they learned in school to their games, and later everything in their games to their lives. Standing before the school that drizzly day in May, it was like I always felt when I stood outside St. Patrick's Cathedral. Intimidated. Wasn't as big as I remembered, but it was still scary. Hell, it too was a holy place, sort of. There, second room on the third floor, I sat near the window, behind Sherman, who had nits. He wore a stocking on his head the day I learned to spell airplane and aeroplane. I remember looking out that window and wondering, I was always a good brooder, what in the world I would do with this new, staggering information. Well, I didn't do too much, I thought, looking up into that questioning space of static air as if to answer myself, kind of like hitting a fungo, dropping the bat, running to deep left center field for 40 years to make the grab myself. Well, let's see, I mulled, pounding the pocket of my emotional mitt. I had parachuted from 104 airplanes. I've flown enough airplanes to blacken the sky. I had an air medal from the war. Hell, it's not like I forgot how to spell the words airplane and aeroplane, for Christ's sake. But I guess I had disappointed myself that I really didn't do too much with the buzzwords of my generation. Didn't launch the space age with them, that's for sure. Some of the other kids did lots better. Carl Sagan was out there somewhere on those streets as a kid. I'll bet he looked up from Punchbowl and daydreamed beyond the clouds and over the roofs and asked, why? Yeah, he did something with up and outer space. Aeroplanes, indeed. And over in Bensonhurst was a kid named Larry King, who must have stopped in the middle of Johnny on the Pony to look another kid straight in the eye and ask, are you kidding me? Yeah, he was always working on what? And inner space. And besides, he had the Brooklyn Dodgers to think about. What more was there to do? Me? I guess I was always just looking down at the spit marks left on the street to mark my place in the games, as if the concepts of time and plain space could matter to a kid. It started to rain. Hard. I broke away from the school and took a wide circle to 13th Avenue. Taking a deep breath, I walked into the grocery store of my childhood and of my life. It was just as it should always be, always as before. It simply was. I remember the story of poor Moses asking God what to call him when the children of Israel asked who had sent him. And God said unto Moses, tell them I am that I am. Wow. And this grocery store was what it was. It just was. And it was wonderful, a bringer of life, a way of life. Today, as before, it smelled of foods to nourish families, sweet foods which had lived before they died and would live again in the strength they gave to make little legs jump and big dreams come true. Sausages and yellow raisins, sharp cheeses and smoked salmon, Turkish candies and Italian oils, Jewish rye bread and Columbia coffees. Oh, foods in bins and in cases, food strung from the ceiling and spilling over from stacks. Here were the omnivarious goodies of the world come to town. I swallowed the smells and ingested the sights. Ah, it was good to be back there. Human hands touched the food, placed it in bags marked with quick crayon glyphs that only a grandmother could identify without opening. And then the flat pencil from out behind the ear struck the bag and ran over all the numbers like an alien probe, and boom, the entire bill was totaled. It probably had been 100 years since the grocer's pencil made a mistake. No electronic gear available today was as quick as the grocer's eye. Who were those guys? Yeah, from those hands and out those bags, I had been fed as a boy. When you ate in such celebration, someone was sure to ask the next day, so what'd you have good to eat? In my neighborhood, they would ask 3 questions. How's business? How's the family? So what'd you have good to eat? A guy could get his doctorate explaining the significance of those 3 questions. A guy could get to be the university president explaining the order of those 3 questions. A guy wouldn't have to explain any of that to anyone in my neighborhood. We all had doctorates, sort of. I moved around the store in a kind of floating suspension. Captain James T. Kirk on the Starship Enterprise, trapped in another dimension, trying to make contact and get back. I was surprised when what I said was answered by men who ran the store. Old men with Eastern European accents, asked my grandfather's name, and talked wisely among themselves in a hushed, quick language, which was many languages. The one with the wisest eyes of all, liquid eyes and sad, the color of corn silk, nodded and made slow faces, expressions of human emotion like from an animator's drawing someone flicked with his thumb to make a penny movie. My eyes filled when he said something I couldn't quite make out, but it made me feel like 7 years old again, and at home. I was starting not to feel so good. Looking backward is its own kind of dizzy. Maybe I should have stayed in Manhattan with the Vietnam vets. That's the kind of crazy I understood. I had to leave. Back outside, the rain had stopped. I stood still on the corner trying to remember how to exhale. The mind is a paranoid creature which looks both ways for truth. On finding none, it looks in. And I felt a great rising swell of a truth gathering from within me, carrying me with it, cruising off my intellectual edges like a tsunami waiting to dash ashore and take all before it to a splintered inland place of new truth and modified agreement. Emotionally, I crested with it. Physically, I swayed on the street corner to the rhythm of its rising, and then it fell in on me, crashed over me, brought me up a mile down my soul, a drowning new thing, clinging to this day as if it were a palm tree. The dry truth was that life is not a linear experience. It does not sequentially occur to us like falling dominoes, one flat day at a time. No, there are levels of knowing, and many ways to know it. Science is a way, and loving too, maybe even death. No one knows. There are levels of simultaneous truths which give the character of a thing its place and its time, its meaning and its value. And all of my life, all of all life was happening everywhere at once, to all of us. The ones who went before and the ones who are now, and most especially the ones who would be. All at once, now, and forever. Oh, shit. Vietnam and dead babies, Brooklyn days and Asian nights happening all at the same time. 40 years ago and 40 years from now, 40 days and 40 nights, it's all desert and it's all right now. Cries from the street brought me up from my guts. The street where I was born was barricaded with wooden horses, like a street scene from a students' uprising in Paris. Actually, it was for a raising up of students. These days it was a play street. Young men, Orthodox Jews, in their early 20s, leaned on car fenders and observed the children like urban shepherds, attentive of their flock. The boys roller skated on the glass-smooth asphalt with a ferocity and competitiveness which seemed inconsistent with the calm demeanor of the young rabbis in traditional dress. I remembered the fierce play on that street, and I knew something about Israeli ground troops and their ancestor Maccabee raiders. The street was smooth, all right, and so was their blood, but the street was hard, and the kids were tough, the rabbis were serious, and their games were not play. I had played different games in a different time, but I too had been prepared for the same inevitable struggle. We of the old neighborhood were always prepared for the inevitable. Darting in and out of the cars, skating behind delivery trucks, we kids of Brooklyn developed the speed and grace to zigzag through the crossfires of Verdun, Normandy, Incheon, Khe Sanh. Always it was the street which prepared us for the mud. I was standing on the corner of the street where I was born, on my side of the street. I could leave now. I could keep the memories and walk. In 2 hours I would address many thousands in Manhattan. I didn't have the time for this. I wouldn't owe me an explanation if I just turned around and left. I walked straight to my house. It was just as before. I could have closed my eyes and heard the sounds. "Ooh, Steve-a-la, supper time!" I looked up in that second-story window from which I was called from ball games and sword fights. It was just where it always was, a window to the world. But it didn't look real this day. Once my mother or my grandmother would have been up there behind it. Now I felt it was only a facade. If it opened, maybe the whole world would be on fire behind it. I was getting a little nauseous. The houses on either side were remodeled duplexes. Mine was just as it was. It had no color, just like the black and white memories I had of my childhood. Time as a concept turned to silt in my head. The stairs up to the porch were lined with lion-clawed flower pots, just as before, the sandstone demigods of my play. I used to be fascinated with the cold stone feet of those lions, and would pet them and talk to them, as if the rest of their bodies were there. Christ, 40 years and the same flower pot still there. I patted the head of one of those creatures that still wasn't there, and it felt just right. I was starting to get really nauseous. My feet started for the top of the stoop, slowly, like when I'd waddle up with a load in my pants. I could sense through the bottoms of my feet that on each step of my ascent up to those stairs of my childhood, the friction was less real, that movement and record were shuffling. I felt the concrete steps relax into sand, and the sand became a mix of air and fear. I went up slowly in the space, yet I fell backward in the time. In those days, there were chairs under the windows where my mother and I would take the afternoon air. I have a sense of her reading a book with one hand while rocking my carriage with the other. The air was sweet. I had no thought of the people who might live there now, not until the old lady peered from behind the drapes. She snapped me out of the past with an expression of terrible alarm. "I used to live here when I was a boy. I just came back for a look around." This said in a tone and pitch contrived to speak volumes of my gentle nature and innocent intent. It is difficult to seem what you are. She moved from the window. I went to the front door, hoping she wasn't calling the cops. She passed from the inner door to the outer door. She just stood there, in that glass-encased, airless dead space, which allowed us to enter the home in winter by degrees. I knew behind that door, then and now, would merge. She wore a grandmother's sweater and a grandmother's shoes, a shapeless woman of enormous energy and profound sorrow. She had eyes like a startled sparrow, and I loved her like she was my own. "I can't let you in, I can't let you in," she said in a Yiddish accent so thick, so rapid I wasn't sure of her words, but I was certain of her meaning. "It's mein grandson, I would let you in," she said, holding the door just wide enough to permit me to enter, as if some real monster would be unable to squeeze in with me. I moved to protest that she shouldn't let me in, but then I was there, inside with her, in that place of deep-breathed limbo, between the cold outside world and the warm family home. The last time I was in that vestibule, my grandmother wrapped a scarf around my face and head like I was a mummy, and told me to walk to school backward against the wind. What lifetime was that? 20 years later, moments before a dawn patrol, I would walk back inside a straw hut, sit back down at the wooden table, with a sigh and a deep breath, and guiltily return to eat my unfinished breakfast rice, just like my grandmother would have wanted. No wonder we lost the war. When I went back outside to where the troops were waiting, the sergeant respectfully asked why I had gone back inside. Looking up to the heaven where my grandmother was now pleased, I properly responded as if talking to a retard. "Because, Sergeant, I want us to have a good day, that's why." On that patrol, we killed 3 old men and a small boy. From somewhere within me, they watched as the old woman's face before me now and my grandmother's then became one. I was born here, nice lady. We moved when I was 7. And then I cried. I don't know why, I just did. Like maybe when you're in therapy or something, you talk about a thing that you didn't mean to, and you cry, and it's all right. I know, she said, as if she knew. I knew she knew. Before she was a Jewish grandmother, she'd been a Jewish mother. Before that, who knew what? But she knew all right. And all I could do was cry and be comforted by this little woman with the large sweater, who after a time led me into the house, like I was family. He was in the kitchen, the prince, and the bananas. The prince was in his high chair. The mashed bananas were everywhere, on his face, in his hair, squishing through his fingers, sliding down the wall, everywhere but in his mouth. In his mouth there were only protests against bananas, against high chairs, against no ice cream, against me. He was the kind of kid rednecks take to Kmart just so they can say no and spank for the morning, while the rest of the world, shopping in the next aisle, wonders what the kid's done and whether to call the cops. Damn rednecks. I can't shop in Kmart since the Nam. Can't bear to hear a child cry. I've got to wait for a sale at Saks to get a deal. Nobody spanks his kid in Saks. God'll punish you and make you poor again. But the prince, had never been spanked, and never would be. The prince had self-esteem and a job to do. Find out what's wrong now and fix it when he grew up. I liked him. He was my kind of kid, a little prick. He reminded me of me. I took this in with a glance as his grandmother fell to her knees with a wail and a washcloth. With her free hand and without looking up, she waved, "Go, go, walk around for a look-see. There's changes, no?" My feet shuffled me away with a milk horse mentality. They knew the route. I was just along for the ride. I wasn't surprised at all that the first stop would be at the end of the hallway, just past the kitchen. It was a large walk-in closet today, but it didn't used to be. During the war years, this room was the sanctuary of survival. I stood there, arms dead at my sides, in the open mouth of what had simply, profoundly been the pantry. A wide-open, floor-to-ceiling cavern devoted to food. Cans and jars, boxes and cartons, all shapes, all sizes, stocked for all appetites in stacks, shelf upon shelf. In the old days it had stood ready like for an open wall locker inspection. Always right. This World War II ration family had been combat ready. We stored and hoarded, bartered and cajoled for the children. Mothers and grandmothers ate sparingly from it and gave generously. Yet there wasn't any love in the pantry. I remembered that. In the pantry there was only war, a real war, against poverty and hard times. It existed like an ammunition dump at the far end of the house, revered, distant, often inspected, and not a little feared. The love that came with the food was added in the kitchen, as the food was cooking, as the food was being served, as the meal was being shared. In those days, the real living room was the kitchen, and the kitchen table was the altar for the life experience. To pull up a chair at supper time was to sit together in a kind of worship. It was a special time when the events of a harried or boring business day could be reconstructed as a joyful adventure. A time when conversations and confrontations could be reworked to allow the family members to feel good about themselves, good enough to go back again tomorrow, as they always did, to earn more food for the pantry. Sometimes, as a boy, I would be sent from the kitchen on a mission to the pantry. This was a big deal to a little kid, a bag of egg noodles or a jar of peach preserves. Had this been the pantry of my Italian grandmother a few blocks away, I would have been sent for a salami or some rotini pasta, an equally solemn occasion, but when completed, the cause of less celebration. A nod, perhaps, or a tousling of hair was praise. And I would stand once in a while in this cathedral of a room and ponder the condition of the starving kids in Europe, the ones I would hear about so often at mealtime. And I would wonder with all my child wonder, how much of this magnificent room's food a starving child my age could eat, all at once. Would he even believe his eyes in such a room as this? I decided a starving kid could eat it all, starting with the graham crackers, which is where I would start, and next the applesauce. Jeez, how lucky to be a starving kid and get to eat all you wanted. I was abstractly envious and wondered if I would one day meet one of those kids. I decided yes, and that we'd eat Melamars for a week and then play war. Wait, I had had that thought before, and it had not been 40 years since I remembered thinking that. And suddenly I was there, at the edge, wrestling on the ledge of then and now like Holmes and Moriarty, on the precipice, and we fell over and down, plunging through the perfect past, tumbling into the cold, thinning dead past to stop dead, dangling on the sheer face of an outer wall memory, suspended 20 years up by the seat of my realities, stuck on an outcropping of well-rooted moment of pantry and war, of madness and survival. 20 years before, in the back country of another continent, I sat in a hand-woven chair sharing a corner of an adobe with a chameleon. Just him and me, hiding as best we could, his complexion more effective than my camouflage. The sun, 2 fingers from the horizon, 2 flesh-eaters waiting for the killing time. Always a personal time beyond thought, a neutral, instinctive time, when immediate motive and transcending dream meet in a soulful silence to say their last goodbyes. The man-warrior and the lizard-hunter were allies in our separate intentions, friends from within our common natures. This day, within hours, one or both of us could be dead. If not, others, strangers to us, would be dead. I do not know in what deliberation or reptilian trance the chameleon waited. I brooded over a care package goodie and tried to think of nothing. That night I was going to attempt to infiltrate a jungle insanity that separated villagers from food and their enemies from humanity. I was playing war for keeps. People were starving. I was eating a Mellomar. And puff, I was standing in the pantry in the middle of a daydream, just like now I was standing in the pantry in the middle of the same daydream. Oh, God. That day in the bush, when the sun set, I tossed a cookie at the chameleon, waved a perverse happy hunting from the door like some big-titted Swedish girl in a 1950s nudist film. Next morning I came back, and he was gone. Maybe like the 5 Viet Cong I had met on the trail were gone. Or maybe like me, he was just still hunting. I could hear the prince screaming for ice cream from the kitchen. I moved into the main body of the house. Christ, it was like entering a museum after dark, and I felt it should have been guarded. That it was guarded. By what, I wasn't sure. But I really felt unsettled, observed. It was me watching me, making certain that I did not take away or break any of this room's treasures. Look, touch, but do not move a memory. I could feel myself fall into play, a huckle-buckle who's got the buckle kind of game. The clapping got louder and louder the closer I got to feeling like the little me again. Shit, what was I doing here? I was a poet, for Christ's sake. I was due to perform in a fucking hour or two, and I was here in Brooklyn in an old house I hadn't been in for 40 years, with an old lady I could hardly understand and a brat kid who wouldn't stop crying. And here I am, tiptoeing around in the back bedrooms of a stranger's home, looking for memories from World War II on the day that New York was welcoming us home from the Vietnam War. Great timing, schmuck. Oh shit, I was stressed out. Out of time, out of place. And yet how could I be? This stuff was in me. Always. It was me. Oh shit, I was fucked. And there was the window that looked out to Johnny's house, my friend. A real tough, first one I ever knew. Johnny only played marbles for keepsies. Spent the 4 years I knew him wearing pants with precisely the same hole in the left knee. Didn't make a difference which pair, always the same hole. The kid was a study in tough. Used to have a permanently runny nose. Just like some kids would throw their heads back to make a curl behave, Johnny used to curl up his lip and suck the snot back up his nose. What a kid. Johnny was my first hero. He taught me how to talk mean and look bad. At least he tried. Later, much later, I could do those necessary things, but as a kid I was a failure, even with the nose thing. Johnny could do it, sure, but he used to get colds. He was supposed to get colds. He was a goy, whatever that was. Me, I got allergies. You only got colds if you didn't eat right or dress right. I tried that runny nose routine, and instead of that wet trail of life which ran down the manly gutter from under Johnny's heroic nose, all I got was a yellow bubble the size of Mars on my upper lip. It looked terrible and made my eyes water. Johnny was so neat. He said neat things. Up your hole with a mellow roll. Up your ass with a piece of glass. What a guy. I practiced all that stuff in front of my grandmother's mirror, and it somehow never seemed to work. Where was that mirror? I stood in the master bedroom of the stranger's home and moved a fancy chair away from the vanity table so I could be at exactly the right place in this room where I would practice my tough guy speeches in that three-way mirror. Oh, beam me up, Scotty. Once a day after school, I'd stand there for a few minutes looking at myself from all directions. All I had to do was move my eyes to get a feel for the true impact of my ferocity. One afternoon, I was practicing really ugly faces before I went outside to use them on Johnny. Dirty Jew, mocky bastard, snarl, snarl, holding a really menacing look. I scanned the 3 mirrors with my eyes. I had to admit this was the best yet. I looked pretty scary for a 7-year-old kid who had a hay fever attack at lunchtime and had eyes swollen the size of manhole covers. About that time, my mother sticks her head between the slightly opened glass doors. Sweet Stephen, when you're finished in there, I have something special I'd like to tell you. At the table, I licked the cream from the wrapper of my Yankee Doodles when she told me she was Jewish. I just looked at her kind of funny, like for the first time. Outside the rest of the day, I just sort of walked around, not getting into anything, just working on it. I don't know how a person could be 2 things at the same time. How could she be Jewish and be my mother? And besides, what was Jewish? I was too embarrassed to sleep, and a little angry, too. Heck, that was the meanest I ever was so far, and I never get the chance to show Johnny now. He wouldn't have believed it. Several weeks later, I was in front of the mirror again. I was really getting good now, that's for sure. Dirty wop, dago, sumbitch, greaseball, great stuff with my ugly faces. A couple of minutes later, here comes my grandmother. She's got a plate with my favorite on it. Thick sliced black pumpernickel bread with rich creamery butter an inch thick and sliced again into 5 fingers so as a guy could pick 'em up one at a time. Sitting on the bed, bouncing and humming while I ate my bread, I listened vaguely and then intently as my grandmother told me that my father, and therefore me too, was Italian. Oh, God, not that. I mean, what did a kid have to be? Everything? For Christ's sake, can't a guy call a guy some names? Shoot. It was all I could do to finish my bread, almost. She also told me I was an American, and that was like being everybody all at once. It was really tough being a bad guy in Brooklyn. Everybody was everything. Truly, I thought, as I reminisced in that back room, in my whole life since I left Brooklyn, as a boy of 7, I never met a gook, or a nigger, or a spick, or in anything. I didn't like many people since Nam. In fact, distrusted almost everybody. But that was always because of who they were, not because of what. And my first best friend, Johnny, was killed in Vietnam. I found his name on the wall by accident at the dedication in '84. Story was he got shot in that left knee of his and didn't have the sense to stay down. Just kept coming and coming. Tough guy. Got the Silver Star, posthumously. They buried him in a new uniform, and I bet you anything you got to lose, chump, you could dig him up tomorrow, and there'd be a hole in that left pant knee. Tough guy. Back in the kitchen, the prince was protesting the spoon of strained pears poised precariously in front of his pursed lips by his grandmother's left hand. I recognized it was the left hand immediately. And why not? The left hand was the hard arm, the one they always used on us to guilt us. It was the one if you didn't eat from quickly, when they held it out to you, you could give them a heart attack. Great message, eat or kill your grandmother. I wonder if anywhere, at any time, one of those kitchen bullies with the huge breasts and those smothering hugs ever did just keel over and die. You know, just held out her arm until the kid's face turned blue and the old lady's turned white and she just dropped. Boy, I'll bet you that kid was sorry. Poor Grandma. Shit. It was in that posture, then, with her arm outstretched, the cuff pulled above her wrist, that I noticed it, the purple tattoo on her forearm, and my heart stopped. Here, right next to the pantry of my childhood, was one of those starving kids from Europe. And worse. Oh, my God, the concentration camps. Oh, God. She looked up as I re-entered the room, and I sensed she had seen that look before, that expression on a stranger's face of pity and of revulsion. Smiling warmly, she rubbed her arm, slowly, like it was an orphaned child. She added a nod to the brave motion, which seemed to say, yes, it's true, but life goes on, and we must live it. She never lowered the spoon from the prince's mouth, and I wanted to strangle the little shit. My eyes brimmed, and I shook my head a little like I was Steinbeck's Lenny, and sat heavily into a chair. I was in a kind of numbed stupor, a profound disorientation, too much life for one day. Yesterday and today crowded my reason. I was truly dizzy. I wanted to leave, but I felt like a 7-year-old. Where could I go? She began singing, cooing really, a folk song, Russian maybe. The prince was steadfast. It was like I wasn't there. She was giving me the room to be miserable. I looked back up at her. Seated, I was at eye level with her arm. Her tattoo appeared blurred through my tears, and somehow I was focused on the second digit, the 7. I studied it as from a great distance. It swam like a magnified protozoa in the liquid of my eyes. I felt of it, disappeared and descended into it, a perverse kind of target fixation. It had a kind of wiggle like a tadpole's tail, and I wondered of the monstrous moment of indefinable pain and untranslatable shame, at what child pulling of her hand against the Nazi's needle had caused that twist on something twisted, like a venereal wart on the flesh of a rapist's inadequacy. I looked away as the arm began a slow chugging toward the tunnel of the prince's mouth. Choo-choo, open wide, here comes the choo-choo, woo-woo-wee. The tunnel stayed closed. I was definitely going to kill this little stinker. Some time later, over tea. Boy, was I late. While Sweet Boy napped and banana-faced ice cream dreams, the old lady, who I began to realize was not old, told me, "I was a small girl, one of twins. Mengele, the angel of death, something something in Yiddish, selected us personally. He used us for experiments, something more in Yiddish. No saliva graced my throat. I suffered paroxysm of dry swallowing and sat there, too ill even to choke. In the beginning," she continued, "there was no roof on Auschwitz and very little water to drink. Black clouds would gather and the children would huddle together and wait, and when the rains came, we would open our mouths wide as we could, close our eyes. I would shield mine eyes with mine hands, so to see my sister drink. Such joy to watch raindrops dancing, dancing, dancing on her tongue." She told me of many things, but none more significant than her accounts of the human compassion shown her by some ordinary German citizens when later she toiled in forced labor. That she could articulate even one gesture of humanity from the bowels of such contempt for the dignity of all life was like watching the fiddler on the roof dance on the lip of my teacup. She did not tell me, nor did I ask, but I sensed that her sister was not as strong as she. I started to tell her things about myself and our family, but it was too late for that. And my tears at our goodbye went unnoticed by her, as she too was now unfocused, was elsewhere, in another time. We wobbled at the door as if some mad projectionist was running the film backward and forward. We were out of sync, each in a space of our own. We said nothing. Our hands groped for each other. And as I left the home where I was born, a couple of wars before, the rain fell straight and steady on the streets where I had played, and I stopped halfway up the block to open my mouth to heaven and to drink, and the raindrops did not dance on my tongue, nor in my soul. I walked like I'd forgotten how and descended from Brooklyn into the chthonic world of the BMT, the real New York, now. Outside the subway car, on the way back to Manhattan, the subterranean world of dark and dirty timelessness matched my mood. Inside the car, the flat paint of the transit authority fought with the inks and crayons of nameless, faceless vandals, a serpentine, linear battle of half-wits, the no versus yes struggle of rebellion against establishment for the graffiti title of the underworld. The black Madonna face of Miss Subway's 1985 commanded a position of honor in the front of the car. It graced the vulgar mural scene with a mustache serenity. The misspelled promises of explicit sexual favors scribbled on her forehead seemed to contort her impassive smile into warm obscenity. Her poster was a microcosm of the conflict in the car, maybe of the world. Somewhere in this, a real statement about social confusion and basic human needs run aground, underground. Somewhere in what seemed to be adolescent mischief below the grasp of authority were the primitive, almost Cro-Magnon drawings of a section of American society trying to explain its anguish with sex and government. Here, the concept of love on the Madonna's face, and the vandal's need to control that love in the fuck, violent rape of beauty, was a conflict too involved for a veteran on this special day of homecoming. But still there was much of this visit to answer. I sat alone in that crowded car, swaying to the rhythm of the tracks like a solitary Bronson-esque figure with a $500 raincoat over my suit and a two-bit sneer on my face, which invited no company. What was it about my childhood that got me into this middle-aged upheaval? Brooklyn was long before Vietnam. All American men my age suffered the bad luck and ill-timing of drawing Vietnam and women's lib in the same 10 years, sort of like getting hit by a truck the same day they told you about the stomach cancer. Sure, we were prepared for a world that no longer existed. Sure, we were this nation's last generation of heroes, unburied dinosaurs, extinct only in our lack of purpose. Our nation would honor us, if only it could, posthumously, but it ignored us instead. But that had nothing to do with the message of Brooklyn, or the message I would share in an hour from now in Manhattan. Brooklyn, too, was about love and war. But it was more. It was, I felt, but could not reason, was about peace as well. Somehow in Brooklyn's indefinable condition of social acceptance, of identity and mutual respect for separate ways, there was a human climate conducive to cooperation, a commitment to survival and to new beginnings. There was something in that place of many people that took on the character of one person, a good one. In that bright thought, quick as a tunnel opens, I changed my mind for the day and my purpose for a lifetime. On the way to speak of war to men who had fought one, I decided to speak instead of peace, which none of us have ever known. On that day, May 7th, 1985, I became a warrior for peace, because I was born in Brooklyn, and in my heart would stay there, a human being. The Prince and I have work to do.
You've been listening to Brooklyn with Love, from the book Warrior for Peace by Steve